The Trump administration is making headlines again. This time, it's about potential refund checks for Americans. These checks could be bigger than the stimulus checks sent out during the pandemic. Remember those? $1,200, $600, then $1,400. Yeah, those were weird times, but this time we're talking about even more money. The idea is that Americans have overpaid on taxes, plus the government wastes a lot of money. Shocking, I know, so the thinking goes, why not give some of that money back to the people? Of course, the devil is in the details. How much money are we talking about? Who qualifies? And where is all this money coming from? These are all questions that need to be answered. But one thing's for sure, if these refund checks do go out, they'll have a big impact. The Trump administration argues that Americans are overtaxed. They point to a bloated tax code filled with loopholes and exemptions. These complexities, they say, lead to Americans paying more than they should. Then there's the issue of government waste. We've all heard the stories. The government spends millions on things like studying the mating habits of snails or building bridges to nowhere. It's enough to make your head spin. The Trump administration is basically saying, look, we know the government isn't perfect. We know we've made mistakes. So let's try to make things right by giving some of your money back. It's a compelling argument, but is it enough? This is where things get interesting. Elon Musk, the guy who makes electric cars and dreams of colonizing Mars, is now involved in government finances. Apparently, he's leading a team to find waste and fraud in the federal government. Think about that for a second. The guy who wants to send people to Mars is now auditing the Department of Education. It's like something out of a weird political satire. But hey, if anyone can find inefficiencies in a bureaucracy, it's probably the guy who revolutionized the car industry. Musk's team is reportedly finding all sorts of crazy stuff, like Social Security payments going to people over 120 years old. Which, unless we've discovered the fountain of youth, seems a tad suspicious. Section 4, Impoundment, a controversial power. Now here's where things get really complicated. To fund these refund checks, Trump is considering using a power called impoundment. Basically, this allows the president to refuse to spend money that Congress has already approved. It's a controversial power, to say the least. Critics say it gives the president too much control over the budget. They argue that it undermines the separation of powers. After all, Congress is supposed to have the power of the purse. But supporters of impoundment say it's a necessary tool to rein in wasteful spending. They argue that Congress often appropriates money for projects that are unnecessary or even downright ridiculous. Impoundment, they say, gives the president the power to say no to these boondoggles. Section 5, the impoundment debate, Congress versus the president. The debate over impoundment goes back decades. In the 1970s, President Nixon tried to use impoundment to defund programs he didn't like. Congress pushed back, passing the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974. This law placed limits on the president's impoundment power, but it didn't eliminate it entirely. And that's why we're still talking about it today. The Trump administration argues that the president still has the power to impound funds under certain circumstances, but Congress disagrees. They say that any attempt to impound funds without their approval would be unconstitutional. It's a classic Washington standoff, and it's unclear who will blink first. Section 6, Unspent COVID-19 Funds, a financial puzzle. Remember all that money Congress allocated for COVID-19 relief? Yeah, well, a lot of it hasn't been spent. We're talking billions of dollars just sitting there. Some of it was given to states and cities, and some of them are being investigated for not using the money as intended. Oops, this unspent money has become a focal point in the refund check debate. Some people argue that it should be returned to taxpayers. After all, they say, it's your money. You should decide how it's spent. Others argue that the unspent funds should be used to address other pressing needs, like reducing the national debt or investing in infrastructure. It's a tough call. On the one hand, giving money back to taxpayers is always popular. But on the other hand, there are a lot of worthy causes that could use the funding. Section 7, the economic impact, a much-needed boost. So what would be the impact of these refund checks on the economy? Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Some economists argue that it would provide a much-needed boost to consumer spending. People would have more money in their pockets, which would lead to more shopping, more dining out, and more economic activity. Others are more cautious. They argue that the impact of the refund checks would be temporary. They point out that people might just save the money or use it to pay down debt. In that case, the economic impact would be muted. The truth is, nobody knows for sure what the impact would be. It depends on a lot of factors, including the size of the refund checks, who receives them, and how people choose to spend or save the money. It's a gamble, and only time will tell if it pays off.